The Behind the Book lecture series is made possible by World eBook Library, the world's largest database of portable ebooks for academic research, and the World Heritage Encyclopedia, the world's knowledge at your fingertips.
He was unstable, bouts of hypochondria and extreme paranoia. He was scandalous and super influential in the revolutionary spirit of his day. He was a contrast. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was Hollywood before there was Hollywood. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a man who typifies the idea of the classical liberal education. He was a political philosopher. He was also a novelist. He was a free thinker. His interests touched on many things. In his early days, he was a rather indifferent student at best. He wasn't very good. It was thought that he would be a tradesman. And then he was apprenticed to an engraver. He did not like that work at all. He didn't like the workaday life. So he actually ran away and ended up for a while being exiled from that city as a result. Rousseau had a string of very strange affairs with women throughout his lifetime. He produced any number of illegitimate children that he would then abandon, which was ironic for a champion of great moral education. He hooked up with an interesting gal, a woman who was over 10 years older than he was, Madame de Warens, who would become an important figure in his life, a woman that Rousseau would call Mama, who would eventually take Rousseau as a lover when he reached the age of 20. This woman was a free spender with a great library and a lot of wonderful social contacts. So she introduced Rousseau to the intellectual life, to independent exploration of scholarship, and really helped make him who he was. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was particularly influential in the revolutionary spirit of France. He lived in the 18th century, which was a very tumultuous time in politics around Europe. The great problem in Rousseau's day, at least as he perceived it, was the problem of inequality in society. He was living in an age in which industry was changing, manufacturing was changing, colonialism had become very competitive. And so the ticket to wealth for nations in Rousseau's days was empire and great collection of capital. And this was changing the way that people made a living. It was changing the way that people became rich or poor. Initially, the displacement of these socioeconomic changes caused tremendous inequality, in particular in France. The target of his writing was to specify types of government or types of education that would make humans equal. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract was published in 1762, which is a very propitious time for political writing in the history of France. The full title was The Social Contract, or Principles of Political Right. He was a passionate debater. He wanted to set politics right. And the social contract is the most comprehensive expression of his rather revolutionary political thinking. It was based on the idea that individuals were pretty wonderful creatures and that they had inherent individual rights. The job of good government was, number one, to leave individuals alone by and large. Number two, to empower them through proper education and some just provisions for a stable society. Rousseau's conception of society involved two layers. There was sort of government society and civil society. Civil society was the one that interested him most. It was where people actually lived and interacted, and there were all sorts of interactions and individual pursuits that Rousseau said the government should not touch. The job of government largely was to stay out of the way. On the other hand, he argued that government derived from the people, so he viciously attacked the idea of inherited monarchy or the right of any given individual or given family to rule. So he wanted representative, today we might refer to it as democratic government, but he also wanted limited government that stayed out of the way of civil society, that stayed out of the way of basic human interaction. Today we have a word for the sort of political thinker that Rousseau was in America. We call it a libertarian. He became the philosophical voice of the French Revolution. His thinking was adopted by the Jacobin Society with famous members like Robespierre, who would go on to lead at least the first phase of the French Revolution. Some of Rousseau's sayings literally became battle cries in the streets, as people used his philosophy to galvanize the crowd and to overthrow the monarchy in France. Unfortunately, some of his sayings also became used to excuse the abuses of revolutionary France when things got out of control. The revolutionaries managed to topple a government. They did not manage to build a stable government. He had high belief in the individual, low belief in government, and as a result, you do not see a lot of stable government coming out of his devoted philosophical followers. One of the great issues, the much debated issues in Rousseau's day, had to do with slavery and the use of slavery, whether it was an unacceptably exploitive practice. Did it take wealth away from certain people? And Rousseau entered this debate on slavery not from the socio-economic or just government side of things, but from the very individual side of things. Underpinning all of Rousseau's thought was the idea of the noble savage, that man in nature was just an amazing creature. And one of his problems with contemporary society in his day is he thought we had become too socialized. We had become too refined in a sense. He saw this in his educational theories as well. He wrote extensively on proper education of the young. And his idea was that a young human came into the world perfect. Your job was to not mess the child up when you educated him or her. In slaves around the world, in African slaves, he saw a representation of the noble savage, of man in his natural state. He didn't spend a lot of time arguing against the institution of slavery, but he did spend some time arguing about the nobility of the slave. His thinking should have ameliorated some of the abuses, but it didn't. For him, it always boiled down to the individual. Anything that threatened the sovereignty of the individual, Rousseau viewed with great suspicion. If that were grand university structures, he would attack them. If it was unjust government, he would attack that. If it were large economic corporations, he would attack that. If it was the church, he would attack that. He really wanted to be left alone. He wanted people to be left largely to their own devices. One of the great ironies of history is that people that followed Rousseau's philosophy most closely, that championed his thinking most strongly, most vociferously, were the French revolutionaries that became so excessive in their practice of violence that it was unprecedented. The Rousseauian revolution became extraordinarily bloody because basically his followers became terrorists. So if Rousseau walked into today's world and beheld some of the terrorist movements that we see around the globe, how individuals and small groups of people are terrorizing larger populaces, I think he would be challenged. What makes for just civil society if people are really hating each other, really attacking each other for deep-set ideologies? I'm not sure he has an answer for that. I think he would see two dynamic themes in the world. On the one hand, he would be incredibly excited about representative governments that give great space for individual rights in society. But Rousseau would be very suspicious of any sort of government intrusions on life. Were he to walk into his France today and see the influence that socialist theories had on French government and French societies, he would probably be worried, because he would distrust pervasive social government. He would distrust a caretaker government, or a government that provided too much in too many areas. Rousseau, first and foremost, was a libertarian. They don't need a maternal government. That weakened the individual. Rousseau would still have a lot to say to the Europe of our day.